Minneapolis shimmered under a golden sun as Daniel Brooks, a soft-spoken environmental lawyer, flipped through legal files beside Lake Harriet, the breeze rustling papers like quiet warnings. A black man in a public park doing nothing wrong yet. ICE agents pulled up boots striking pavement like thunder. Papers now one barked. But Daniel didn't flinch. "I'm a U.S. citizen," he replied, voice calm but firm. The cuffs clicked anyway, slicing into his wrists. Blood dripped, but his dignity didn't falter. What they didn't know, they'd just detained a hero of environmental justice. Can one man's truth shake an entire system? If this outrages you, share this story. Comment, "Justice," and tell us where you're watching from. June. Heat shimmered across Lake Harriet. Soft waves catching sunlight like shattered glass. Daniel Brooks sat on a weathered bench near the shoreline, dark hands folded over a thick file of environmental court documents. His suit, navy and worn at the elbows, clung to him in the warmth, but he didn't flinch. He was focused, reading line by line, lips tight, jaw tense. He was alone, or so he thought. Behind him, a mother jogged past with a stroller. A man tossed a tennis ball for his Labrador. Families lounged under oaks in the distance. But one person, someone not from here, watched him through tinted glass. In a black SUV parked half a block away. ICE agent Mark Tate lowered his sunglasses. Tate's voice crackled through the radio. Possible undocumented male. Black, mid-40s. Loitering near city infrastructure. No crime. No reason. Just a man. But Tate's mind was wired for patterns, and his pattern said alone, black-focused equals trouble. He pulled the SUV forward. Daniel turned the page in his file. He didn't notice the vehicle at first. His mind was still deep in a case he'd been building for months, a lawsuit against a chemical company that had dumped waste into the Mississippi River, poisoning miles of water and thousands of lives. He'd fought too long and too hard to back down now. His voice had moved city ordinances, his petitions had shut down illegal sites. He wasn't a name, he was a cause. "Excuse me." The voice cut the air like a blade. Daniel looked up. A man stood before him, clean-shaven, tactical vest badge glinting under the summer sun. "I need to see your papers." Daniel blinked. "Excuse me. Identification. Immigration documentation. Now." Daniel stood slowly, calm but firm. "I'm Daniel Brooks, a citizen, an attorney. I work right downtown." Tate stepped closer. "That's not what I asked." There was a shift in the wind. Nearby, a boy stopped riding his bike. A jogger slowed down, unsure. The lake kept rolling quiet and oblivious. "You must be mistaken," Daniel said, his voice even but laced with disbelief. "I was just—" "Step away from the bench," Tate ordered, already unsnapping the cuffs at his side. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "I have every right to sit here. This is a public park." Tate's jaw clenched. "You fit a description. Refuse and we escalate." There was no description, no warrant, no probable cause, just a badge and a bad assumption. Daniel exhaled slowly. "You don't want to do this." But Mark Tate had already made his choice. He grabbed Daniel's arm. The struggle was brief. Daniel didn't resist, only braced himself. Cold steel wrapped around his wrists. The cuffs clicked tighter than necessary. The file on pollution law tumbled to the ground, scattering papers across the grass. "Sir, what are you doing?" a voice called out. A woman in her 30s had stopped nearby, phone raised. "He's a lawyer. I've seen him speak at the city council." Tate ignored her. "He's under investigation." "For what?" she shouted. Tate didn't answer. He turned Daniel around, forcing him toward the SUV. The sun beat down harder now, the heat radiating from the pavement like a warning. Daniel kept his head high. Even as pain laced through his wrists, even as confusion turned to humiliation, he refused to let his dignity go. This wasn't his first fight. But something in his eyes, something in the silence he held, made Tate pause, made him wonder. Daniel's voice, low and steady, drifted over his shoulder. "You don't know who you just put your hands on." Tate laughed. "I don't care. But he would. Soon. And across the lake, someone else was recording. Someone who wouldn't stop at just filming. Someone who would make sure the world saw this moment. The moment a good man was handcuffed for sitting in the wrong place with the wrong skin, doing nothing wrong." The hallway of the Brooks Environmental Law Center hummed with the quiet rhythm of dedication. A printer whirred. A distant phone rang twice, then silence. At the far end, behind a frosted glass door, Daniel Brooks stood facing a photo on the wall. It was faded from sun, and time him in his 30s, arm raised in front of City Hall, thousands of protesters behind him demanding clean water after the Morris Creek spill. 20 years of work. 20 years of lawsuits, town hall speeches, death threats, late nights with bloodshot eyes, and cold coffee. He didn't do this for awards, but they came anyway. Framed plaques, certificates, commendations. In the corner, the Star Tribune headline still hung in bold print: Minneapolis's Guardian of the Green. His assistant, Lila, a young Hmong woman fresh out of law school, knocked gently. "Your 10 a.m. call with the Native Water Alliance is ready." Daniel smiled, voice gravelly from disuse. "Patch me in." She turned back, paused. "Daniel, you okay?" He looked down at his hand. A faint red mark still circled his wrist where the cuffs had bit into him yesterday. He pulled down his sleeve. "I'm fine." But he wasn't. He hadn't told Lila, or anyone at the firm. Not yet. How do you explain being handcuffed for sitting in a park with legal files? How do you explain the humiliation? The disbelief that still clung like sweat on his skin? He joined the video call. 4 tribal leaders greeted him warmly. As they spoke, Daniel leaned in, nodding. His voice gained strength, explaining the latest EPA loophole and why corporate attorneys were exploiting a new permit exemption. "We'll challenge it," he said. "On state and federal grounds. We'll make noise." Like always, one elder chuckled. "You're our river warrior, Daniel." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. After the call, he left the office early. He walked past the community mural on 4th Avenue, his face painted beside Greta Thunberg and Winona LaDuke. He used to feel pride seeing it. Today, he looked away. At home, his wife Celeste stood in the kitchen, hands dusted with flour, humming to Stevie Wonder. She turned, spotted him. "You're home early, counselor." He kissed her cheek. "Just tired." "You never come home tired unless something happened." He sat at the table, ran his hands over his bald scalp. "Icy stopped me yesterday at Lake Harriet." She froze. "What do you mean, stopped?" demanded Papers. "Wouldn't believe I was a citizen. Called me a fraud. Cuffed me. In front of people." Her hands tightened on the edge of the counter. "You didn't resist, no. Did they hurt you?" "Oh, just bruised my wrists. And something else." "What?" He looked up at her. "My trust. That even after all these years, all this work, one man with a badge can still strip me down to just black." Celeste sat beside him. "Daniel, you're more than that." "I know." But he didn't. He pulled out his phone, opened a message. Someone filmed it. It's online now. Thousands of views. Celeste stared at the screen. "Then it's time people know." Daniel shook his head. "What good does it do? IC won't care. Cops like him. Mark Tate, they won't stop." Celeste reached over, held his hand. "Maybe not, but the people will." Outside, sirens wailed in the distance. Inside, Daniel sat silently. The pain wasn't in the cuffs. It was in the erosion of faith, slow and constant like river water over stone. He had fought to protect the earth, but now he had to fight for his place on it. The decision came not with fire, but with quiet resolve. Daniel stood, grabbed his briefcase, and pulled from it a folder labeled Lake Harriet Incident. He placed it on the table. Celeste looked at him. "You're going to make it public?" Daniel nodded. "Let's see if justice still matters, not just for the planet, but for people who look like me." Morning fog lingered low over downtown Minneapolis, curling around the buildings like breath held too long. Daniel stepped out of the courthouse brief in hand, chin lifted despite the dull ache in his wrists. His gait was slower than usual, as if every step required recalibration. As he crossed the street toward the bus stop, a voice rang out. "Mr. Brooks, you're our hero." He turned. An older man with silver braids and a windbreaker waved from a hot dog cart. Behind him, a group of schoolchildren stood in line waiting to buy snacks. One of them whispered, "That's the guy from the clean water case." Daniel forced a smile and waved back, but something twisted in his chest. He reached the bench near the light rail, the same type of bench where he'd sat just 2 days earlier when it all started. He thought he might feel comfort, or at least familiarity. Instead, he felt watched, not by people by the past. Every glance lingered a little too long. Every nod from a stranger felt heavy with unspoken sympathy. The video had gone viral overnight, a clip just shy of 2 minutes. Daniel in a suit standing with his arms raised trying to reason. Tate barking orders, the cuffs, the blood, the silence afterward. That eerie, stunned silence. On his phone, news outlets had already started dissecting the footage. Some praised Daniel's composure. Others asked if IC had overstepped. None questioned why it had happened in the first place. That was the part Daniel couldn't shake. That quiet question. Why was I never presumed innocent? Back at the office, Lila was waiting with coffee and hesitation. Channel 4 wants to do an interview. So does WCCO. Also, the City Bar Association is asking if you're pressing charges. Daniel didn't answer. He placed the file on her desk instead. I need background on Agent Mark Tate. Employment history prior, complaints anything. Lila blinked. Are you going after him personally? No, Daniel said. I'm going after the system that created him. Later that day, he walked to a small park off Franklin Avenue where retired Judge Angela McCready liked to sit and read. She'd mentored Daniel when he was just a law student, back when all he had was student debt and a fire in his chest. She looked up from her book as he approached. You look like you've seen the other side of the world. I've seen something colder, Daniel murmured, sitting beside her. She closed the book. They humiliated you. He nodded slowly. They reduced me to a threat in the span of 5 seconds. Are you going to fight it? I don't know how. Not in the usual way. Angela studied him, her voice low. What they did to you wasn't a mistake, Daniel. It was muscle memory. Systems don't stutter, they repeat. He looked out at the kids playing on the swing set nearby. So, what now? Lawsuit press conference? No, she said. You do what you've always done. You build. He nodded more to himself than to her. Then I'll start with this city. As he left the park, a chill cut through the air despite the sun now high overhead. Daniel crossed over into a neighborhood where he'd once led a cleanup effort. The creek still ran low, its banks muddy with runoff. A single crane pecked along the edge. He watched it a moment, breath slow, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, a hand-drawn map of communities affected by recent pollution waivers. IC didn't scare him. What scared him was losing ground in a fight that wasn't done. He looked at the paper, then toward the skyline. There was still work to do, and this time it wasn't just about rivers or soil. It was about dignity. A storm hovered on the edge of the afternoon sky as Daniel returned to Lake Harriet. The bench he'd been cuffed beside sat empty, the grass around it still slightly worn where people had gathered filming, gasping, yelling. He stood there for a moment alone as the wind moved through the trees and joggers passed without a glance. Then he saw him, Agent Mark Tate. Tate wasn't in uniform. Jeans, a gray polo shirt, and mirrored sunglasses. He leaned against a parked ICE vehicle like nothing had happened, like he hadn't shoved a citizen into the dirt. Daniel didn't move. Tate noticed him pushed off the car with a slight smirk and walked over. His tone was casual, almost amused. You're back. Brave. Daniel folded his arms. Not brave, just not running. You know most people would have filed a complaint and hid behind lawyers by now. I'm not. Most people, Daniel said calmly. You made that pretty clear when you cuffed me for sitting on a bench. Tate's expression tightened just for a second. Then it returned to smugness. You matched the call. We had a report. There was no report. Tate stepped closer. You think because you're educated, because you've got a tie and some plaques on the wall, you're above suspicion. I think because I'm a human being, I deserve basic dignity. Tate's jaw flexed. You're just trying to make a name off this, he sneered. You people always do. Daniel's eyes didn't flinch. And what name would that be? The one you ignored when I told you I was a lawyer? Or the one you dismissed because it didn't sound white enough? Tate's nostrils flared. A woman nearby paused with her toddler phone raised slightly, not filming yet, just watching. I suggest you walk away, Daniel said. Voice even. You threatening me? Tate asked, stepping closer. No, I'm telling you the truth. You made a mistake, and if you were smart, you'd step back before it gets worse. The woman was definitely filming now. Tate's mouth twisted into something between a grin and a grimace. You know what I think? I think you're just another angry... Say it, Daniel said softly. I want to hear you finish that sentence. I want the camera to hear it too. Tate froze. Behind them, another ICE agent had stepped out of the vehicle watching the scene with growing discomfort. Daniel stepped forward, lowering his voice. You think you're untouchable because you've got a badge and a gun, but badges tarnish and guns jam. What doesn't break is the truth. And the truth is, you didn't see me as a man. You saw a problem. He turned to walk away. Tate reached out, grabbed his arm. And that was when it happened. A woman screamed. A dog barked. The agent from the SUV ran forward shouting, Tate, stop! But Daniel had already pulled free. He didn't punch, didn't yell. He stood still. Tate stared at him, chest-heaving eyes wild. You're done, Daniel said low. This time the whole country's watching. The other agent stepped between them, glancing back toward the growing crowd. Tate, back off. Now. Reluctantly, Tate stepped away. Daniel adjusted his sleeve where the agent's hand had gripped too tightly. He walked back toward the lake, ignoring the whispers, the cameras, the questions. He didn't owe anyone anything, not right now, not yet. He reached the water, bent down, and picked up a small flat stone, tossed it once, twice, then he threw it across the surface. It skipped 5 times before sinking. Just like that moment. But this time, he wouldn't let it disappear without leaving ripples. The day after the confrontation, Daniel stood in front of a packed auditorium at the University of Minnesota. Cameras lined the back wall. Microphones lined the podium, and rows of students, activists, lawyers, and journalists sat quietly waiting. He didn't prepare a speech. He didn't need one. I was handcuffed, he said plainly, voice echoing in the hush. For existing. He paused. I wasn't protesting. I wasn't breaking the law. I wasn't resisting. I was reading court documents, researching how to stop illegal pollution along the Mississippi. The crowd shifted, some already nodding. I was approached by a federal agent. He asked for papers. When I said I was a citizen and an attorney, he called me a fraud. A quiet gasp. I was struck, restrained, publicly degraded. Not because I posed a threat, but because I fit a prejudice. He stepped from behind the podium. I've spent 2 decades fighting for environmental justice. But no amount of law degrees, awards, or clean drinking water will protect you from a system that still sees your skin before your worth. He looked out at the audience. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because I'm not the only one. What happened to me is part of something bigger, and it's time we name it. From the back row, someone stood. A black woman in a suit. She raised her phone. Tell them what he called you. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. He called me a black fraud. Murmurs surged. Cameras clicked. Another voice called out. What will you do now? Daniel drew a breath. I'm filing a civil rights complaint. Not just for myself, but for anyone who's been stopped, searched, or shamed for existing in their own country." The room erupted in applause. Outside, media vans were already circling. The clip of his confrontation with Tate was now being broadcast across every major outlet. Hashtags. Trended. Nationwide. Justice. For Brooks. Black Weil. Brilliant. ICE. Abuse. That evening, Daniel returned home to find his porch covered in letters. Envelopes, stacked handwritten notes tucked under the welcome mat, even a bouquet of sunflowers tied with a card that read, "Thank you for standing tall." Inside, Celeste stirred a pot on the stove. She glanced at the window, then back at him. "You've become a movement." "I didn't want to," he said, pulling off his blazer. "I just wanted a quiet moment by the lake." Celeste set down the spoon, came to him, and pressed her forehead to his. "You were never built for quiet." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay awake watching the ceiling fan spin. His phone buzzed once, then again. He checked the screen. A message from a number he didn't recognize, just a name, Sarah Kim. The second message, "I was there." "I'm sorry, can we talk?" His pulse quickened. He remembered her, the young agent who had hesitated, the one whose eyes had darted unsure when the cuffs were slapped on. She had looked like she wanted to speak up. He typed tomorrow, 9 a.m., Brooks Law Center. At dawn, he stood by the office window looking down at the empty street. His reflection stared back, older, tired, but not broken. This wasn't just a legal battle now. It was a reckoning. He turned back to his desk where a thick folder of affidavits and video transcripts lay open. A document sat on top his official complaint to the Department of Homeland Security. He picked up a pen, signed his name with a firm stroke, then leaned back and exhaled. The ink barely had time to dry before the phones started ringing. And, somewhere across town, Agent Sarah Kim sat alone in a quiet apartment rereading her message, knowing that silence had a cost and hers was about to come due. Minneapolis Detention Center was a low-slung concrete building that didn't try to hide what it was. The windows were narrow slits. The walls buzzed faintly with fluorescent lights that never turned off. And inside, behind one set of steel bars, Daniel Brooks sat upright on a metal bench, back straight, hands resting in his lap. The blood on his wrist had dried, but the sting remained. He had given his name a dozen times, repeated his Social Security number, quoted legal statutes until one officer stopped and said, "You sound like a lawyer." "I am," Daniel replied. "Or I was before you took my briefcase, my phone, and my rights." That shut the room into silence. Now, hours later, he sat in a holding cell. No clock, no windows, just the occasional shuffle of footsteps beyond the wall. The silence wasn't just physical, it was emotional, like time had stalled to ask, "Are you still who you say you are when no one believes you?" Daniel looked down at his scuffed shoes. He thought of his father, a preacher who taught him that even a bent reed could grow tall if it found the sun again, and his mother who worked nights at a hospital and mornings at the church soup kitchen, who once told him justice doesn't come easy. That's why we fight for it. Across the room, another detainee wept softly. A teenager, maybe 17, maybe younger. Daniel stood and walked over. "You okay?" he asked, voice low. The boy looked up, red eyes wide. "They said my papers are fake, but I was born here." Daniel nodded slowly. "What's your name, Luis?" "You got a lawyer?" The boy shook his head. Daniel's hand tightened into a fist, then released. "We'll get you one." The door clanged open. A guard stepped in. "Brooks." Daniel stood. Phone call. They walked down a long corridor light flickering above. The guard didn't speak, didn't look at him. They passed two ICE agents leaning against a desk, chuckling over a video on one of their phones. "That's him," one whispered, nudging the other. Daniel kept walking. In the small interview room, a rotary-style phone waited on the table. The guard shut the door behind him. Daniel picked up the receiver. "Daniel." The voice was gravel and thunder. Judge Angela McCready. "I'm here," he said. "I saw the footage," she said. "So did the Star-Tribune. So did half the city." Daniel closed his eyes. "There's a protest building outside." Angela continued. "WCCO is here. Environmental groups, lawyers, students, and a couple of folks from the governor's office." "Tell them to wait," Daniel said. "No," she said firmly. "You've waited long enough." A pause. "They're filing a motion now," she added. "You'll be out by morning." Daniel opened his eyes, but the light felt too sharp, too artificial. "Angela, there's a kid in here. No documents, no lawyer, nothing. I'll send someone," she said. "You focus on getting out. I can't just walk away. You're not. You're walking forward." When the guard returned, Daniel didn't resist. He walked back to the cell, sat down, and told Luis. "They're sending someone for you." "Why would they care?" the boy asked bitterly. Daniel looked at the narrow sliver of window where a crack let in the faintest breeze. "Because one day, someone cared enough to come for me. Outside, the chance had already begun. Free, Daniel Brooks' justice, now inside." Daniel smiled, not because he was free yet, but because the system had just started to feel the pressure of a truth it couldn't contain, and he wasn't alone anymore. 3 days had passed since Daniel was released from custody, but the bruises still clung to his wrists like reminders that justice had a price. His office, once a quiet sanctuary of legal books and court briefs, had transformed into a command center. Phones rang off the hook. Protesters gathered daily outside City Hall. The media lined up for quotes. And Daniel, he barely slept. Celeste brought him coffee and a folded paper. "Page 1, she said, placing it gently in front of him. Star-Tribune's headline screamed across the top, "Black lawyer wrongly detained by icy city demands answers." Daniel scanned the article. His name, his record, the confrontation at the lake, all laid bare. But his eyes caught on something else. A quote from a Minneapolis resident, "Daniel Brooks has done more for this city's environment than any politician. If they can treat him like this, what hope do the rest of us have?" He looked up slowly. "It's not just about me anymore." Celeste nodded. "It never was." At noon, the protest surged outside the federal building. Hundreds chanted his name. Environmental banners waved alongside signs that read, "Citizenship is not a skin tone," and "Protect Daniel, protect us all." Inside a quiet studio on the north side, a woman watched the coverage alone. Agent Sarah Kim hadn't left her apartment in 2 days. She'd replayed the video again and again, the moment Tate barked black fraud, the look in Daniel's eyes, the blood, the silence. She remembered her own hesitation, how her hand trembled when she almost stepped forward, and how she froze. Now she couldn't forget it. That evening, she pulled out her phone, hesitating only briefly before pressing record. "My name is Agent Sarah Kim," she said, voice shaking. "I was there when Agent Tate arrested Daniel Brooks. I should have spoken up. I didn't, but I will now." She continued her words, slow, deliberate. "There was no probable cause. There was no legal justification. What happened was about race. I can't stay silent anymore." She uploaded the video to her private account, sent it to WCCO TV's anonymous tip line, then powered off her phone and cried. The next morning, Daniel was halfway through a meeting with local civil rights attorneys when Lila burst through the door, phone in hand. "Sir, you need to see this." She tapped the screen. It was Sarah's video, raw, unpolished, but real. Daniel watched in silence. The attorneys stopped talking. The room held its breath. She confirms everything Lila whispered. The racial targeting, the lack of cause, it's all on tape. Daniel stared at the screen as Sarah's face faded to black. He didn't speak. One of the attorneys leaned forward. "This changes everything." Outside, chants still echoed in the distance. Daniel stood slowly. "We call a press conference. Today. Everyone." That afternoon, with news crews packed shoulder to shoulder, Daniel stepped to the mic. There comes a point, he began, when silence is no longer neutral, it's betrayal. He held up his phone. An IC agent has stepped forward. She confirmed what many already suspected, that my arrest wasn't a mistake. It was an act of racial profiling carried out under the color of authority. The crowd was electric. A wave of murmurs surged like wind through trees. "This isn't just about me," he continued. "It's about every black man who's been questioned for walking. Every immigrant child taken without cause. Every person who's been told their citizenship depends on how quietly they comply." He stepped back, eyes blazing. "We won't be quiet anymore." And across town, Mark Tate watched it all unfold on a grainy TV in his precinct's break room, jaw-clenched fingers twitching. He didn't know it yet, but the walls were closing in. His badge would no longer shield him. Because the truth had finally found its voice, and it was loud. The video hit 1 million views by midnight. By morning, it doubled. By noon, CNN picked it up. Agent Sarah Kim's quiet confession had pierced through the public fog. She didn't cry on camera. She didn't shout. She simply spoke the truth, and that made it all the more devastating. Her words echoed across newsrooms, activist circles, and federal offices like a siren they couldn't ignore. Daniel watched it unfold from his desk back straight, phone muted. His inbox flooded with messages, congressional staffers, law professors, civil rights leaders. People he hadn't spoken to in years suddenly remembered his name. But none of that moved him like the message that came handwritten on lined paper slipped under the door. "Thank you for standing when others kneel. My son was detained too. I pray this time somebody listens." Daniel held it in his hand for a long while, reading it again and again. The legal team moved fast. Within 24 hours, they filed a civil suit in Minneapolis federal court. The target, Agent Mark Tate. But, more than that, the suit named IC leadership for enabling a culture of unchecked profiling. This isn't about one man with a badge, Daniel said at the filing announcement. It's about an entire system that allowed him to think it was acceptable. Tate's lawyer called the case political. A publicity stunt, he scoffed. But the public wasn't buying it. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of 3,000 had gathered. Indigenous elders stood beside immigrant families. Black pastors and environmental scientists shared the microphone demanding not just justice for Daniel, but justice for all. That same evening, Celeste found Daniel standing at the kitchen window, staring at the garden he'd barely tended all summer. "You haven't said a word since the hearing," she said gently. Daniel didn't look away. "I keep thinking about Luis, that kid from the holding cell. I don't know what happened to him." Celeste came beside him. "You did what you could. I gave him a name, but names don't always matter in systems that erase them." He turned to her, eyes tired but lit from within. "This has to matter, Celeste. I can't just walk away after this settles. I want to make sure no one else sits in that cell wondering if their life's work was just a disguise for someone else's target practice." She cupped his face in her hand. "Then, don't stop. Make it count." Meanwhile, Agent Sarah Kim was placed on administrative leave. She received death threats. Her family in California went silent. But she stood by her words. When WCCO-TV asked if she regretted coming forward, her reply was simple: "I regret staying silent as long as I did." Across town, at an emergency ICE meeting, Mark Tate sat surrounded by men in suits who had once nodded at his reports without reading them. Now they asked questions with clipped voices and narrowed eyes. "We've got optics problems," one official snapped. Tate crossed his arms. "So throw me under the bus." Maybe we should, another muttered. But it wasn't just optics anymore. Internal memos were being leaked. Emails, personnel files, and the Department of Homeland Security had announced a preliminary investigation. One phrase in their public statement echoed louder than the rest. Systemic misconduct may have occurred. Daniel didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. Instead, he drafted a proposal. By midnight, it was 10 pages long, detailing a plan for an independent oversight board, legal access for detainees, and cultural competency training for all federal enforcement agents operating within the city. He didn't want vengeance. He wanted change. And as he printed the final draft, Celeste stood in the hallway, arms crossed, watching him. "You really think they'll listen?" Daniel looked up, the faintest spark in his voice. "They're already listening. The question is, will they act?" It started with a sunrise. Daniel stood on the steps of City Hall as a gold light spilled over the skyline. His breath rose in the cool air, and the sound of feet shuffling and signs rustling filled the plaza below. It wasn't just a crowd anymore. It was a movement. Thousands had gathered. Students, elders, clergy, families. Environmental groups marched shoulder to shoulder with immigrant rights advocates. A mural of Daniel's face had been painted overnight on a nearby wall, haloed in green vines, and the words, "We stand with Brooks." At the podium, Daniel adjusted the mic. "This city has seen injustice before he began. We've seen it in redlined neighborhoods, in poisoned rivers, in detention centers built like cages. We've seen it, and now we refuse to look away." His voice carried across the plaza. A sea of phones recorded. Some people cried, others stood fists raised. "I was detained without cause," he continued. "But I wasn't the first. And if we don't act, I won't be the last. The IC system must be held accountable, not just for my arrest, but for every name erased, every story silenced, every life disrupted by suspicion." He paused, letting the silence settle. "I want reform. Real reform. Community oversight, public transparency, cultural competency, legal safeguards. It starts here, it starts now." As the crowd erupted in cheers, Celeste stood just beyond the barrier, watching him not as a wife, but as a citizen. Proud, steady, silent tears rolled down her cheek. Back inside City Hall, Daniel met with council members and civil rights officials. He handed over his proposal, 10 pages of change written in plain English. Not politics, not policy games, just people's needs written as law. One councilwoman leaned in. "We've never seen the city respond like this. You've tapped into something deeper." Daniel nodded. "Because it's always been there. We just gave it a microphone." That same afternoon, DHS announced a formal internal investigation. Tate was placed on indefinite leave, and Sarah Kim, her video now viewed over 12 million times, agreed to testify. Meanwhile, Agent Tate drove west, avoiding reporters and cameras. He stopped in a small diner off Route 212, ordered black coffee and dry toast. When the waitress asked if he was that guy, he didn't answer. He wasn't just angry. He was unraveling. Everything he believed about authority, about who deserves it and who doesn't, had been shattered by a man who never raised his voice, just stood tall. Tate clenched his jaw and flipped open a newspaper. Daniel's face stared back from the front page. The headline read, "He didn't back down." Back in Minneapolis, Daniel received a call from a familiar number. "Luis," he asked. The boy's voice trembled. "They found my file. They're letting me stay. A lawyer came for me, said you sent him." Daniel's throat caught. "I'm glad you're safe." The boy paused. "They called me illegal. You called me by my name, thank you." After the call, Daniel stepped out onto the building's rooftop. The skyline shimmered in twilight. The lake where it all started sat quiet in the distance, its waters calm again. Behind him, Lila approached. "You have a meeting with the governor's office next week." Daniel turned eyes weary but focused. "They want reform. They want to talk about a task force. Statewide." He nodded. "Let's make sure they know it's not just talk." She hesitated. "You think it'll hold the change?" Daniel looked back at the city lights flickering to life like stars below. "It has to," he said. "Because if it doesn't, we'll be back here again. And next time, the cuffs might not come off so easily." He turned to leave, the wind tugging gently at his coat. The rooftop door clicked shut behind him. And below, in the heart of a city still healing, the people kept chanting his name, not as a victim, but as a reminder that resistance, when rooted in truth, can ripple into something unstoppable. A light drizzle fell over Minneapolis, soaking the courthouse steps as Daniel approached with a coat draped over his arm and his briefcase in hand. It was quiet, but the tension in the air was louder than any protest chant. Inside, court officers whispered. Federal officials moved with clipped urgency. A hearing had been scheduled, one that would officially accept the civil rights complaint and open the door to a broader investigation. But before Daniel could reach the courtroom, a staffer rushed out from the clerk's office. "Mr. Brooks," she said, breathless, "someone from ICE just leaked internal emails to Channel 4. Daniel's eyebrows rose. "Emails." She handed him her phone. The screen glowed with screenshots. Messages between senior IC officials discussing Daniel by name before the incident at the lake. Subject lines like "Brooks, interference," "high-profile nuisance," and "Tate has eyes on him." Daniel read them slowly. His jaw clenched as the implications hit. This hadn't been random. It had been planned. He looked up at the staffer. "Who leaked this?" She shrugged. "Anonymous tip line." But word is, it was someone inside. Agent Sarah Kim watched the story break on the news from her small apartment. Her hand hovered over the remote, trembling. The leak hadn't come from her, but she felt the walls cracking. She opened her laptop and began typing. Not a message, not a post. A sworn affidavit. Back at the courthouse, reporters were already waiting. As Daniel walked toward the building, a dozen microphones turned his way. A reporter called out, "Mr. Brooks, how does it feel knowing ICE targeted you personally?" Daniel didn't pause. It confirms what people of color already know, that existing in public while black can be seen as a threat. Inside the hearing room, the judge, a stern woman with silver hair and a steel gaze, called the proceedings to order. Daniel sat at the plaintiff's table. On the other side, IC's legal team shuffled papers, visibly rattled. Their lead attorney, a man with a tight tie and tighter voice, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we request a delay due to the recent media leaks." The judge glanced at Daniel. "Mr. Brooks." Daniel stood. Respectfully. "Your Honor, justice delayed is justice denied. We've waited long enough." She nodded slowly. "Motion to delay is denied. Let's proceed." As Daniel made his opening statement, Celeste watched from the gallery, her hands clasped tightly. The courtroom filled with quiet gasps as he recounted what happened that day at Lake Harriet, how he was asked for papers, accused of being a fraud, shoved to the ground while blood traced down his arm. He didn't cry. He didn't yell. He simply told the truth, plainly and precisely, like he'd done in thousands of legal battles, but this time the stakes weren't just about rivers and regulations. They were about dignity. That evening, WCCO-TV aired an exclusive segment. Not just the leaked emails, but a sit-down interview with a source who chose to go public. Agent Sarah Kim. "I was there," she said. "I heard Agent Tate use the term black fraud before he even approached Mr. Brooks. It wasn't a mistake. It was an order fueled by bias. And I stayed silent. Until now." The city erupted. Protests turned into organized sit-ins at IC offices. City council members demanded answers from federal liaisons. Civil rights groups called for a congressional review. Hashtags flooded the internet, pattern not isolated. Brooks was targeted. Justice leaks. And Daniel. He sat in his living room, quiet fingers folded under his chin. The TV flickered. Celeste sat beside him. "You knew it was bigger than just that one moment," she said softly. "I hoped it wasn't," he admitted. "But now we know." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "So, what happens next?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the screen where Sarah Kim's testimony played again. Her face was tired but steady. What happens next, he whispered, is accountability. Daniel stood just outside the courtroom, head bowed slightly as a chilly wind swept through the corridor. Behind the heavy wooden doors, lawyers murmured, journalists typed frantically, and federal agents shifted in their seats trying to look unbothered. But something had shifted, and everyone felt it. Sarah Kim's affidavit wasn't just a statement, it was a key, and the lock it had turned was opening to a storm. The next morning, Agent Mark Tate was placed under formal investigation, not just for misconduct, but for racially motivated abuse of authority under federal civil rights statutes. IC headquarters in D.C. issued a terse press release confirming a full internal audit. For the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to exhale. He was walking through the downtown government plaza when a bus rolled by its entire side covered with a bold campaign led by a coalition of youth organizers and environmental advocates. The words across it read, "Citizenship has no color. Justice wears no badge. #Stand with Brooks." He stopped and stared at it. "Mr. Brooks," a voice called. A young woman jogged up, clipboard in hand. "We're collecting signatures for a civilian oversight board for ICE in Minnesota. Could we use your name in support?" Daniel blinked, taken aback. "You're already using it," he said, gesturing toward the bus. She laughed nervously. "Yeah, but officially," he nodded. "Of course." Back at the law center, Lila sat at her desk sorting stacks of legal files. Her phone buzzed with constant notifications calls from organizations in Detroit, Houston, even Portland, asking if Daniel could help them form local alliances. She looked up as he walked in. "You're booked for the next 2 weeks if we say yes to all this." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Do I have a choice? You're kind of the face of this now." "I didn't ask to be." "No," she said softly, but neither did Rosa Parks. That made him pause. Across the city, in a cramped apartment full of unpacked boxes, Sarah Kim sat at her kitchen table. She hadn't heard from her family since the interview aired. Her phone rang, constantly calls from reporters, threats from strangers. Even a subpoena from federal investigators requesting full testimony. She sipped cold coffee, staring at the sunlight on her floor, and then a letter arrived, handwritten, no return address. It said, "Courage is never quiet. You did the right thing. We see you." She cried for a long time after that. Meanwhile, Daniel returned to Lake Harriet. The same bench still sat by the water, untouched, almost sacred. He eased down onto it, hands in his lap. A few ducks skated across the surface and the wind danced through the reeds. A jogger passed by, slowed, then turned back. "You're him, right?" the man asked. Daniel glanced up. "Depends. You're the one they cuffed." The man paused. "You didn't deserve that." Daniel gave a faint smile. "No one does." The man nodded once, then walked on. A few minutes later, an older woman with a cane approached slowly. She stopped in front of him. "My grandson. He wants to be a lawyer because of you." Daniel stood. "Then tell him to be better than me." She touched his arm. "He wants to be just like you." As she turned and left, Daniel stood alone by the lake. No news vans, no microphones, no chants, just silence, and the slow return of peace. But this wasn't the end. This was the clearing of a path, a shift in air pressure. A moment where one man's dignity, bruised but unbroken, had rippled outward into something far bigger than himself. A moment where truth had stepped out of the shadows and decided it would never return to them. It rained on the morning of the verdict, but no one left. Hundreds stood outside the federal courthouse with umbrellas and soaked jackets, their eyes trained on the tall building where justice had been debated, dissected, and demanded. The lawn shimmered with handmade signs, "Accountability now," "Justice for Daniel," and "Truth over fear." Inside, Daniel sat at the plaintiff's table, calm but unflinching. His lawyer, Maria Jackson, whispered updates in his ear as Judge LeClaire entered the courtroom, her robe swaying softly like curtains in a slow breeze. "All rise." The room stood. Judge LeClaire took her seat, glanced at the packed gallery, and cleared her throat. After reviewing the evidence testimony and sworn statements submitted in this case, this court finds that Agent Mark Tate did in fact engage in unlawful racial profiling, excessive use of force, and deprivation of constitutional rights under color of law. A collective gasp surged across the room. Daniel remained still, chest rising slowly. This court further acknowledges the systemic failures within the local IC office to prevent such violations. As a result, this ruling includes not only punitive damages to Mr. Brooks, but also mandates a federal oversight directive. The judge's voice didn't shake. It didn't rise. But it landed like thunder. Daniel's team embraced. Celeste let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, and outside the crowd erupted in cheers loud enough to shake the raindrops from the courthouse windows. Later that day, Daniel stood at the same podium he'd visited weeks earlier. "I want to say this plainly," he said, voice steady. "This isn't a personal victory, it's a systemic reckoning. We didn't just prove that one man abused his authority, we proved that silence is no longer an option." He glanced toward the reporters. "There are thousands of people who have been detained, questioned, and silenced. Their cases may not have gone viral, but they mattered just the same." Behind him, Lila held a manila folder close to her chest documents to launch the first citywide review of ICE operations ever proposed in Minneapolis. It would include independent watchdogs, legal defense funds, and mandatory racial bias training. A beginning, not an end. The next week, Daniel returned to the classroom. At the University of Minnesota Law School, he guest lectured in a civil liberties seminar. The students leaned forward in their seats as he recounted not just the arrest, but the silence that followed and how hard it was to speak through shame. "Dignity," he said, "is not a gift a system can give you. It's something you carry until they're forced to see it." One student raised her hand. "Would you go through it again?" Daniel paused, then nodded. "Yes, because someone had to, and I was lucky enough to live through it." That night, he sat on the porch with Celeste, both wrapped in blankets, listening to the wind sweep through the maple trees. His hands still bore faint scars from the cuffs, but they felt lighter somehow, less like wounds, more like reminders. "I never wanted to be a symbol," he murmured. "You're not?" Celeste said gently. "You're a mirror," and the country finally looked in one. The stars above Minneapolis blinked softly. Somewhere downtown, murals of Daniel glowed under street lamps. Not glorified, just honored. Not idolized, just seen. From a quiet corner of the city, a boy named Luis sat with a green card in his hands and a fire in his chest. He was studying hard now. He told his mother he wanted to be a lawyer, like Mr. Brooks, he said. The world didn't change overnight. But it changed because someone stood up when others bowed down, because someone refused to be silenced, because truth had a name and it would never again be mistaken for fraud. And that truth, it walked upright, head high, because justice had finally listened. The courtroom was nearly empty when Daniel returned the following week, not as a plaintiff, but as a witness to something bigger than his own case. He walked quietly to the back row alone, watching as federal prosecutors presented the first phase of a broader investigation into ICE misconduct. This time, the names weren't just his. They were dozens. Men and women wrongly detained families separated people stripped of rights not because they'd broken laws, but because they'd looked like someone who might. Daniel took notes, not for court, but for history. Later that day, in the rotunda of the Minneapolis Civic Center, a city councilwoman stood beside him as reporters gathered. Her voice was firm as she unfolded the next steps. Effective immediately, this city will create the Daniel Brooks Civil Liberties Commission, an independent panel to oversee all federal and local agency interactions involving race immigration and environmental activism. Minneapolis will no longer be silent when our citizens are profiled. Applause echoed against marble walls. But Daniel stayed silent. That evening, he returned to the bench by the lake, this time with a pen and a notepad. No cameras, no crowd, just the breeze and the memory of how it all began. He scribbled ideas slowly, each line a reflection of the movement that had grown from his bruises. Outreach clinics for those wrongly detained. Legal aid for youth like Luis. Workshops for officers who wanted to change but didn't know how. A plan not just for justice, but for repair. Lila joined him around dusk holding 2 cups of tea. "You really don't rest, huh?" Daniel chuckled. "Rest feels indulgent right now." She handed him a cup. "So does justice. Doesn't mean we stop chasing it." They sat in silence for a moment. The last rays of sun dipped behind the skyline. Across the state, Agent Mark Tate had gone quiet. Stripped of his badge, facing civil penalties and the loss of his pension, he refused interviews. His lawyer tried to settle out of court, but Daniel declined. Some things shouldn't be buried in paperwork. Sarah Kim, now working for a civil liberties nonprofit, released a joint statement with Daniel's team calling for national reform oversight legislation and better pathways for whistleblowers. It was signed by over 50 community leaders, 5 state senators, and 3 ICE agents who came forward anonymously. The movement had multiplied. Celeste watched it all unfold from the kitchen, smiling as Daniel's photo flashed again on the TV. But her favorite image wasn't from a press conference or protest. It was the one she took of him in the backyard fixing the fence, sleeves rolled up still, a man grounded in ordinary life. At City Hall, a bronze plaque was installed at Lake Harriet with the following words: "Here, Daniel Brooks stood for justice, unshaken by cuffs, unbroken by silence." The dedication ceremony drew hundreds. Children stood on their parents' shoulders to glimpse the man in the suit who once sat reading by the water. Daniel took the stage, cleared his throat, and looked out over a sea of faces. "I never wanted my name on a plaque," he said softly. "I wanted it on clean water permits, on environmental settlements, on legal motions fighting pollution and inequality." He glanced toward Celeste in the front row. "But if this plaque reminds one child that dignity can't be taken away, then let it stay." He stepped down. A small boy with braids tugged at his coat. "Mr. Brooks, can I shake your hand?" Daniel bent down. "Of course." The boy grinned. "I want to be a lawyer, but also a superhero." Daniel smiled. "Good news. They're not so different." The sun warmed the metal of the plaque as people gathered around it, tracing the etched words with their fingers. Justice had a long road ahead. But on this patch of ground where a man once bled in silence, a new chapter had begun, written in truth, sealed by resilience, and carried forward by all who refused to kneel. Years later, Daniel stood before a crowd gathered at Lake Harriet once more. The sky was clear, the water calm, but the air hummed with the weight of progress and persistence. Behind him, the plaque commemorating the day justice began its slow return gleamed softly in the afternoon sun. He adjusted his suit jacket nerves hidden beneath a steady gaze. The podium held a microphone, but he spoke not just for himself or the crowd before him, but for every silent voice that had echoed through those turbulent years. "This plaque isn't just about me," he began, voice steady and resonant. "It stands for everyone who's ever been reduced to a statistic, a stereotype, or a suspicion based on the color of their skin or the shape of their name. The audience a tapestry of faces, young and old. Black, white, indigenous, and immigrant listened, breath held." Daniel continued. "When I was wrongfully detained here, I felt stripped of my dignity. But what I discovered was that dignity isn't given, it's carried. It's carried by the courage to speak, the strength to stand, and the will to demand better. He paused, letting the words settle like seeds in the fertile ground. This city and this nation have not finished their work. But because of the voices that rose together from lawyers to activists, from whistleblowers to everyday citizens, we have taken steps toward accountability, transparency, and hope. He gestured to the water. The river here flows steadily, carving its path through stone and time. Like justice, it is relentless, patient, and ultimately unstoppable. Behind him, Celeste smiled softly, pride shining in her eyes. Beside her, Lila held a young girl's hand, whispering encouragement. A boy from the crowd, no older than 10, stepped forward hesitantly. "Mr. Brooks, I want to be a lawyer too." Daniel crouched down to meet his eyes. Good, because the world always needs more heroes who fight with truth and heart. The boy grinned, nodding solemnly. As the sun dipped lower, the crowd began to disperse, voices mingling with the rustle of leaves and the gentle lap of waves against the shore. Daniel lingered, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of history and the lightness of possibility intertwine. He knew the fight was far from over. But in that moment, beneath the open sky, surrounded by the echoes of resilience and the promise of change, Daniel felt something rare and precious: peace. A peace born not from endings, but from the steadfast journey toward justice, one step, one voice, one soul at a time.